I'm a 34-year-old mom of 3 kids, ages 3, 6, and 9, and life as well. Let's just say it's an adventure. My days are a blur of snack requests, spilled milk, school drop-offs, and my part-time work-from-home job, which I somehow managed to squeeze into the chaos. My husband Mike works full-time in a demanding office job. He likes to think he has the harder role, often brushing off my day-to-day struggles with comments like, "Parenting's not that hard, you just have to be firm." Spoiler, that's easier said than done when you're dealing with 3 small humans who can smell weakness like sharks smell blood. For as long as I can remember, Mike has this habit of undermining me in front of the kids. If I say no to extra screen time, he swoops in with a "sure, why not? It's just one episode." If I enforce teeth brushing as a non-negotiable, he chuckles and says, "They're just baby teeth." It's like we're playing a game where I'm the strict coach, and he's the fun mascot. Unsurprisingly, this has turned me into the default bad cop, while he gets to bask in his cool dad status. The tipping point started building a few weeks ago. Our 9-year-old refused to do her homework because dad said it wasn't a big deal if I didn't finish it tonight. Cue the power struggle. I stood my ground, but she dug her heels in, clearly emboldened by dad's words. Then there was the time Mike let our 6-year-old skip brushing his teeth entirely, despite me insisting firmly, and for the 3rd time that night that he needed to go back upstairs and do it. Little things like this keep piling up, eroding my authority with the kids and making everything 10 times harder. I tried to talk to Mike about it. I calmly explained how important it was for us to present a united front, especially as the kids get older and start figuring out they can play us against each other. His response: "You're just too controlling. They're kids, they need to relax sometimes." He waved me off like I was overreacting, which only added fuel to my already simmering frustration. Then the final straw broke the camel's back. Our 3-year-old, bless her tiny, tantrum-prone heart, had a complete meltdown because Mike promised her ice cream after dinner. Normally, that would be fine, except she'd already been told no earlier for her less-than-stellar behavior that afternoon. Apparently, my decision didn't matter because Mike decided to swoop in with an ice cream bribe while I was in the other room. By the time I walked in, she was screaming because I'd said no again, and Mike was shrugging like it wasn't a big deal. That night, I decided I'd had enough. If Mike thought parenting was so easy, he could prove it. I told him he could handle everything: school drop-offs, meals, bedtime, discipline, the whole package. At first, he thought I was joking. When I clarified that I was absolutely serious, he smirked and said, "Sure, how hard can it be?" It was the confidence for me. I laid out the ground rules. I'd step back completely and focus on my job and my personal needs. He would handle all the kid-related duties, no exceptions. School mornings, dinner prep, tantrums, and bedtime battles, it was all his responsibility now. The kids seemed equal parts confused and intrigued when I explained the new arrangement. Mike, meanwhile, didn't look worried in the slightest. He actually looked like he was looking forward to it. "This'll be easy," he said. "You'll see." To say I was nervous would be an understatement, but at the same time, I felt validated. If Mike was so sure he could do it better, then fine, let him. Deep down, I hoped this would be the wake-up call he needed, but a part of me worried it might lead to even more chaos. Either way, I was committed. The next morning, as I sat in the kitchen sipping my coffee and answering work emails, Mike's first taste of reality began to unfold. The 3-year-old was refusing to eat her breakfast, the 6-year-old couldn't find his shoes, and the 9-year-old was complaining about the packed lunch she didn't like. I stayed quiet, watching him struggle to juggle it all. He looked frazzled but determined, insisting he had it under control. I could tell this was going to be interesting. As I stepped back and let him dive into the deep end, I couldn't help but wonder how long his confidence would last. The house was already starting to feel different without me steering the ship. The kids were testing boundaries like it was a sport, and Mike was starting to realize just how quickly things could spiral out of control. This was only the beginning. Update 1. Mike started the first day of his parenting takeover with a confidence that honestly made me a little curious. He woke up early, announced that he had everything under control, and got to work making breakfast. I stayed in the background, sipping my coffee at the kitchen counter and catching up on work emails. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. The 3-year-old, usually a picky eater on a good day, flat out refused to eat the oatmeal Mike made. She wanted pancakes. When Mike tried to negotiate, she kicked the bowl, sending oatmeal flying across the table and onto his shirt. Meanwhile, the 6-year-old was wandering around looking for his favorite shoes, which had apparently vanished into thin air overnight. The clock was ticking, and the 9-year-old was pacing the kitchen, reminding everyone that if they didn't leave now, she'd be late for school. Mike scrambled to find something for the 6-year-old to wear, finally settling on a pair of mismatched sneakers that he claimed looked fine. By the time they were out the door, I glanced at the clock. They were running 10 minutes behind schedule. The morning chaos didn't end at drop-off. Around lunchtime, I got a frantic text from Mike. Apparently, he'd forgotten to double-check the 9-year-old's lunchbox and accidentally packed her a peanut butter sandwich, a big no since she's allergic. Thankfully, the school caught it in time and gave her an alternative snack, but Mike was clearly shaken. I didn't reply, sticking to our agreement that this was his show. When he got home from school pickup, I overheard him muttering to himself in the kitchen about how hectic the day had been. He was trying to figure out after-school schedules, but it wasn't going well. The 6-year-old had soccer practice, the 9-year-old had a play date, and the 3-year-old just wanted someone to watch Peppa Pig with her. Mike ended up driving everyone around in a frenzy, barely making it to each activity on time. By the time they got home, the kids were hungry and cranky, and Mike looked like he'd run a marathon. Dinner was a disaster. Mike tried to make spaghetti but got distracted when the 3-year-old spilled juice all over the counter. By the time he returned to the stove, the noodles had turned into a mushy clump. Plan B was frozen chicken nuggets, which only the 6-year-old was happy about. The 9-year-old pushed her plate away, claiming they tasted weird, while the 3-year-old declared she didn't want to eat anything unless it came with sprinkles. Mike looked defeated but didn't argue. After dinner, the house looked like a tornado had passed through. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink, toys covered the living room floor, and the 3-year-old had somehow managed to take every single blanket off her bed and build a fort in the hallway. I stayed quiet, watching Mike try to manage the chaos. Bath time wasn't any better. The 3-year-old refused to get in the tub, throwing herself onto the floor and screaming like her life depended on it. Mike finally coaxed her into the water, but she splashed so much that he ended up soaked from head to toe. By the time he got her out and into pajamas, he looked ready to collapse. Then came the bedtime battle with the 6-year-old, who couldn't find his favorite stuffed animal. Mike spent half an hour searching for it, only to discover it was sitting on the couch the entire time. The 9-year-old, sensing Mike's exhaustion, asked if she could stay up late to play video games. He caved almost immediately, probably just to avoid another argument. By the time all 3 kids were finally in bed, Mike dragged himself into the living room and slumped onto the couch, muttering something about how it wasn't that bad. The house, however, told a different story. The kitchen sink was overflowing with dishes. There were sticky handprints on the fridge, a pile of laundry growing in the hallway, and random toys scattered everywhere. The kids had clearly picked up on Mike's overwhelmed state and were already pushing boundaries. The 6-year-old had left his soccer cleats on the coffee table, and the 3-year-old had dumped a box of crayons onto the living room rug. At one point, Mike glanced at me and asked if I could help out a little. I reminded him of our deal. This was his show, and I wasn't stepping in. He sighed, trudged back into the kitchen, and started half-heartedly rinsing dishes. I couldn't help but feel a little validated, but I also wondered how long he could keep this up. By the time Mike finally made it to bed, it was close to midnight. He muttered something about how demanding the day had been, but I didn't respond. He fell asleep almost instantly, leaving me to reflect on everything I'd watched unfold. If this was just day 1, I couldn't imagine what the rest of the week would look like. Update 2. By day 3, the shine of Mike's initial confidence had completely worn off. He was visibly sleep-deprived, snapping at the kids over minor things, and moving through the house like a zombie. The morning started with the 6-year-old asking if he'd remembered to sign their permission slip for a school trip. Mike froze, realizing he had no idea where the slip even was. A frantic search through backpacks and the kitchen counter turned up nothing. By the time he found it crumpled under a stack of junk mail, it was already too late to send it in. The 6-year-old burst into tears, wailing about how everyone else would get to go without them. Breakfast didn't go any better. While Mike was juggling cereal bowls and trying to soothe the 6-year-old, the 3-year-old managed to knock over an entire glass of orange juice directly onto his work laptop. Mike yelled in frustration, which sent the 3-year-old into a full-blown sobbing fit. He quickly tried to calm her down, but the damage was done. His laptop, dripping with juice, was completely fried. I stayed quiet, watching the chaos unfold from my spot at the dining table, resisting the urge to step in. Later that morning, Mike had a virtual meeting with his boss. From the snippets I overheard, it wasn't going well. His boss made a comment about how distracted he seemed and pointed out a few mistakes in the project he'd submitted the day before. Mike apologized and promised to fix everything, but his voice had that edge of barely concealed panic. Meanwhile, the 3-year-old was tugging on his arm, demanding a snack, and the 9-year-old was loudly announcing from the living room that she couldn't find her math workbook. After school, things continued to spiral. The 9-year-old came home with a math test in hand, one that she'd failed. She looked at Mike expectantly, clearly hoping he'd help her go over it. But he was already dealing with a tantrum from the 6-year-old who was upset about losing a game at recess. When he finally sat down with the 9-year-old, it became obvious that math wasn't exactly Mike's strong suit. After fumbling through a few problems, he gave up and told her they'd try again later. Dinner was another round of takeout, which the kids were starting to protest. The 6-year-old poked at his pizza, muttering about how he missed real food, while the 9-year-old declared she was sick of eating the same thing every night. The 3-year-old refused to eat altogether, demanding ice cream instead. Mike's patience was wearing thin. When the 6-year-old started whining about bedtime, Mike snapped at him, raising his voice louder than I'd ever heard. The room went silent, and the 6-year-old's face crumpled. Mike quickly apologized, but the damage was done. I watched from the hallway as Mike sat down next to the 6-year-old, awkwardly patting his back and mumbling an apology. It was clear he felt guilty, but I stayed out of it. When I asked him later if he needed advice, he waved me off, insisting he was fine. The lack of structure was starting to take its toll on the kids. They were bickering constantly, fighting over toys and who got to sit where at the dinner table. Mike decided to take them to the park to blow off some steam, but he forgot to pack snacks and water. The 3-year-old melted down halfway through the outing, screaming about being hungry. The 9-year-old was annoyed that they had to leave early, and the 6-year-old was sulking because they didn't get to play on the swings long enough. By the time they got home, everyone was in a foul mood, and Mike looked completely drained. The laundry situation was officially out of control. With no clean clothes left, Mike started pulling mismatched outfits from the bottom of the hamper. The kids went to school in wrinkled shirts and socks that didn't match, but Mike didn't seem to care anymore. The house was in complete disarray. There were piles of dishes in the sink, toys scattered everywhere, and a mysterious sticky stain on the living room carpet that no one was owning up to. At some point, Mike called his mom to vent. I overheard snippets of the conversation, and it sounded like she wasn't exactly sympathetic. From what I could gather, she told him he was finally getting a taste of what I dealt with every day. Mike didn't argue, just sighed heavily and ended the call. By the end of the week, Mike finally admitted he'd underestimated how hard it was to keep everything running smoothly. He was exhausted and frustrated, but he still insisted he could handle it. The kids, however, seemed less convinced. They were testing his patience more than ever, and their routines had all but disappeared. I continued to stay in the background, sticking to my promise not to step in. I could see the wheels turning in Mike's head as he tried to figure out how to keep going. He still wasn't ready to ask for help, but the cracks in his confidence were becoming impossible to ignore. Update 3. The weekend started off as a logistical nightmare. Mike, in his quest to handle everything, somehow double-booked the kids' activities. The 9-year-old had a science fair project to finish, the 6-year-old was scheduled for a soccer game, and the 3-year-old was promised a visit to the playground. It wasn't until Saturday morning that he realized everything overlapped. He tried to make it work by rushing between locations, but the chaos was immediate. The soccer game was missed, the playground trip was cut short, and the science project ended up being a late-night scramble. By the time they got home, the kids were frustrated and bickering, and Mike looked completely overwhelmed. That night, he decided to treat the kids to ice cream as a way to smooth things over. Unfortunately, he forgot the 6-year-old was lactose intolerant. By bedtime, the stomachache kicked in, and the 6-year-old was doubled over in discomfort. Mike spent most of the night alternating between cleaning up and trying to comfort them. Meanwhile, the 3-year-old, left unsupervised for just a few minutes, found a pack of markers and used them to create her artwork on the living room walls. Mike discovered the damage just as he was trying to settle everyone down for bed. The next day, Mike decided the house needed a deep clean. The mess had been building all week, and it was clear things were spiraling out of control. He grabbed the vacuum cleaner and started with the living room, but the machine made a strange noise halfway through and stopped working entirely. Mike banged it against the floor a few times, but it was no use. The vacuum was broken, and the crumbs and debris, covering the carpet, remained untouched. Defeated, he left the vacuum in the corner and moved on to tackling the growing mountain of laundry. The kids, meanwhile, were getting fed up. The 9-year-old asked why bedtime stories with mom had stopped, and the 6-year-old complained about the lack of their usual routine. Even the 3-year-old started asking for mommy when Mike tried to get her dressed in mismatched pajamas for the 3rd night in a row. The tension in the house was growing, and it was clear that the kids were missing the structure they were used to. By Sunday evening, Mike finally hit his breaking point. He came into the kitchen while I was finishing up a project for work and asked how I managed to juggle everything without completely losing it. He looked exhausted, his hair sticking out in every direction and his shirt stained from some unidentifiable kid-related mess. For the first time, he seemed genuinely ready to listen. I walked him through what it really took to keep everything running smoothly, how much planning went into coordinating schedules, how important it was to set boundaries and stick to them, and how exhausting it could be to balance the needs of 3 kids while still trying to maintain some sense of order. As I explained, he nodded, his expression shifting from frustration to understanding. Later, Mike admitted he'd been too dismissive of everything I handled and apologized for undermining me in the past. It wasn't an easy apology, but it felt sincere. As we talked, the 9-year-old wandered into the kitchen, overhearing the conversation. She asked if things were going to go back to normal soon, and Mike reassured her that we were working on it. I told him I'd consider stepping back in to help, but only if we could agree to work as a team moving forward. We sat down that night and came up with a plan. We'd split responsibilities more evenly and make sure to back each other up in front of the kids. If one of us made a decision, the other wouldn't contradict it. It was clear that the lack of consistency had been confusing for the kids and adding to the chaos. The next day, Mike took responsibility for fixing the mess he'd created. He spent the afternoon scrubbing the marker stains off the living room walls and catching up on laundry. He even found a repair service for the vacuum cleaner and got it working again. The kids seemed relieved to see us on the same page, and the tension in the house started to ease. That evening, we sat down with the kids and explained the new rules. We'd work together as a team, and both of us would be equally involved in making decisions. The kids seemed happy to see us united, and bedtime that night went smoother than it had in weeks. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I couldn't help but feel hopeful. It had been a rocky road, but it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. Mike had learned the hard way just how much effort went into running the household, and I felt like my efforts were finally being appreciated. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same team. Update 4. Mike started the week by sitting the kids down in the living room. He apologized for the chaos of the past few days and promised to do better. The 9-year-old asked, in her typical blunt way, why he'd been in charge for so long when things clearly weren't working. Mike hesitated, then admitted he'd wanted to learn how hard mom's job is. The kids stared at him like he'd just confessed to being an alien. It was awkward but honest, and I could tell it was a step in the right direction. From that moment, I stepped in to help restore structure, but I stayed in the background as much as possible. Mike needed to take the lead, and I let him. One of our first changes was setting up a shared calendar. We listed the kids' activities, school deadlines, and even chores. It was color-coded and stuck on the fridge where everyone could see it. Mike immediately used it to schedule a family cleaning hour to tackle the mess in the house. He started with the vacuum cleaner, finally getting it fixed after days of ignoring the crumbs piling up on the carpet. The next day, Mike tackled the walls where the 3-year-old had turned into a budding artist. He scrubbed every inch of marker stains while the kids hovered nearby, watching him work. I noticed the 6-year-old was less likely to push boundaries now that Mike was being more consistent with discipline. If he said bedtime was at 8, he stuck to it. If he said no to extra screen time, he didn't cave 5 minutes later. Slowly but surely, the kids were starting to adjust to the new normal. Mike also made it a point to apologize directly to the 6-year-old for forgetting their permission slip earlier in the week. He helped them organize their schoolwork into folders and even set up a checklist to make sure nothing got missed again. The 3-year-old, who had been a tantrum machine just days ago, started responding better to Mike as he learned how to handle her meltdowns with more patience. Instead of raising his voice, he got down to her level and spoke calmly, even when she was screaming about wanting candy before dinner. Speaking of dinner, we made a joint effort to move away from frozen nuggets and takeout. One night, we made tacos together. The kids helped chop veggies with plastic knives, of course, and the 6-year-old insisted on designing everyone's plates with sour cream swirls. It was messy, but it felt good to sit down to a meal that wasn't microwaved. Mike also started encouraging the kids to pitch in with simple chores. The 9-year-old loaded the dishwasher, the 6-year-old put away toys, and even the 3-year-old helped by bringing her plate to the sink after meals. The change in the kids was noticeable. They seemed happier and less argumentative now that there was structure again. One evening, we decided to implement a new tradition, a weekly family meeting. The kids loved the idea of having a say in things, like picking the weekend activity or suggesting new house rules. It gave them a sense of ownership, and it gave Mike and me a chance to stay on the same page. Midweek, Mike surprised me. He announced that Saturday would be my day off. He'd planned it all out. He'd take the kids to the park, handle meals, and even tackle laundry while I could relax. I was skeptical but agreed. On Saturday morning, I stayed in bed a little longer while Mike took the kids out. I spent the day reading, doing a face mask, and enjoying the rare silence in the house. Every now and then, I peeked at my phone, half expecting a call for backup, but it never came. When Mike and the kids came home that evening, the house was still standing, and everyone seemed content. Dinner was simple, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, but it was warm and ready when I walked into the kitchen. Mike gave me a smug look, clearly proud of himself for pulling off the day without any disasters. By the end of the week, the household felt balanced for the first time in a long time. The kids had settled into the new routines. The laundry was finally under control, and the fridge wasn't just full of takeout containers. Mike expressed his gratitude for everything I do, not just in words but in actions. He was more present with the kids, more mindful of the work that goes into running the house, and more appreciative of our partnership. It wasn't perfect, there were still bumps along the way, but it felt like we were finally on the same team. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house wasn't just a place of chaos. It felt like a home again. Update 5. A few weeks later, the house felt like a completely different place. Mike and I sat down one evening after the kids were in bed, reflecting on how much had changed since that chaotic week. The shared calendar on the fridge was filled with color-coded activities, meal plans, and reminders. The kids' routines were running smoothly, and for once, there wasn't a constant sense of scrambling to keep up with everything. Mike admitted he had no idea how much effort went into keeping everything on track. He listed the mental load, keeping schedules straight, planning meals, managing tantrums, and the physical work, like cleaning up endless messes and staying on top of laundry. He didn't just acknowledge it, he apologized for dismissing it before. While it felt validating to hear, I reminded him that I didn't want to win or prove a point. I just wanted a partnership, and it finally felt like we were getting there. Mike started making an effort to be more involved in the daily routines, even after work. He stuck to the shared calendar religiously, ensuring he didn't miss school events or doctor's appointments. He also took over managing the kids' extracurricular schedules, which freed me up to focus more on my part-time job. It was a huge weight off my shoulders, and I found myself with more time to pick up hobbies I hadn't touched in years. One evening, the 9-year-old proudly came home with a perfect score on her math test. Mike helped her frame it and hang it in the hallway, right next to her art project from last year. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot to her. She'd gone from struggling with math to feeling confident, and Mike made sure to celebrate her achievement. The 6-year-old surprised me one evening when he declared, "I like Dad's cooking now." This was coming from a kid who had barely touched anything Mike made during that chaotic week. Mike had been trying new recipes, even involving the kids in simple tasks like mixing ingredients or setting the table. It boosted his confidence in the kitchen, and the kids were genuinely enjoying the meals. The 3-year-old, who had always been glued to my side at bedtime, started asking for Dad to read her stories instead. She even insisted on sitting on his lap during story time, something she hadn't done much before. Their bond was clearly growing, and it was heartwarming to see. The kids noticed the change in us too. One evening, the 9-year-old commented, "Mom and Dad don't argue anymore." It struck me how much the lack of teamwork had affected them. Now that Mike and I were working together, the whole house felt calmer. Mike didn't stop at just helping more. He went out of his way to show his appreciation. One evening, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a heartfelt letter apologizing for how he'd undermined me in the past, and acknowledging how much he'd learned through this experience. He promised to never dismiss my efforts again, and to always work as a team moving forward. I showed the letter to my best friend later, who couldn't stop praising Mike for his growth and effort. We decided to prioritize date nights again. It was easy to get caught up in just being parents and forget about our relationship as a couple. Our first date night was simple, a dinner at our favorite restaurant, but it felt like a reset. We laughed, talked about things other than the kids, and remembered why we'd chosen to do this whole parenting thing together in the first place. By the end of the week, it was clear that the family dynamic had shifted for the better. The kids were thriving with the structure, the house wasn't in constant chaos, and Mike and I were stronger as a team. It hadn't been an easy road, but it had been worth it. The story ends here, but the lessons we learned will stick with us. Parenting is never easy, and no one can do it alone. I'm grateful Mike had the opportunity to see things from my perspective, and I'm even more grateful that he stepped up and made the changes our family needed. We're not perfect, but for the first time in a long time, it feels like we're all moving in the same direction, together.